Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Breaking the Game podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Stephen Gillespie, and joining me, as he has been the past few episodes, is Austin Carr. Austin, how you doing, man?
I'm good, Steven. It's been a long day, but there's basketball on TV, so I can't complain. How about you?
I am battling back-to-back days of no internet followed by no power for hours at a time, so I am just happy that I get to be doing something today here with internet and power, so I can't complain a whole lot there.
Well, I'm sure it's
Right
got to
on.
be tough.
Yeah, but I've still been able to keep up with the games and everything.
Well,
So
good.
yeah, absolutely. Before we get going, I told my buddy yesterday that I was recording and it was his birthday, but Cody Blair just wanted to say happy birthday, man. I appreciate the support that you've been showing the show. Anybody you want to wish happy birthday to, Austin?
Not today. No,
Not today.
no birthdays.
Well, if ever that comes across, feel free to share.
Will do for sure.
All right, man. Well, let's go ahead and get into some news. We'll kind of highlight some of the NBA layoffs as I've been hearing it coined as on other shows. We've had a couple coaches get fired and a general manager step down. That means it sounds like to me that his time was up, regardless if he wanted to be there or not.
Usually what it means.
It's usually what it means. Do you want to go ahead and highlight some of these moves that we've seen, Austin?
Yeah, for sure, man. Well, I don't think there's anything too surprising here in any of these moves, honestly. The first one I want to talk about is Chicago. They fired Jim Boylan. I'm actually surprised they didn't fire him after last year. He's had kind of a weird tenure as their coach. Had a lot of really odd ways of trying to, do things with his team. They had a record of 39 and 84, which is just a 31.7% win percentage, which is awful. And from what I've been hearing going into this season, they thought they were a playoff team, or at least a fringe playoff team. They thought they were going to be a lot more competitive than they were. He had this weird thing that he did during the preseason where he actually put a time clock in their practice center. And he made guys punch in and out for practice. I guess it's like an accountability thing. I just think it seems a little weird to do with professional players.
Right.
And I think they kind of agreed to. And something else that just didn't really fit with him is they ran more post offense than any team in the NBA the last 2 years. And they do have some good bigs, but they're more like stretch players. I think. I mean, what's your feeling on that?
I agree, especially when you're talking about marketing. I think that he's the stretch big that you're looking at there. They do have Daniil Gafford, who is from Arkansas, so I got to show him some love here on the show. But he's not really a stretch guy. And then you got Wendell Carter Jr., who was largely compared to Al Horford coming into the draft, and you're seeing a little bit of that, but not as much as you would like to. And Boylan coming into Chicago, I actually spoke about this on one of the shows that I had with my buddy Couch Coach. Couch, if you're watching, shout out, bro. But we talked about just how his kind of tendencies and his, bring your lunch pill into work attitude and mindset. It's kind of hard to be that type of a coach with a young team for one and then a losing team for two. It's kind of hard to be like, bring your lunch. Only a couple coaches in the NBA right now I know that could get away with doing something like that, or guys like Doc Rivers or Greg Popovich.
Right.
Those are the
guys with an actual coaching pedigree with some experience. It's kind of hard to come in and be like a dictator type of coach like that with no real credibility behind you too. I think that makes it even harder.
Yeah, and not only that, but he got into it with, I mentioned Daniil Gafford earlier. He's a guy that I think he was on like a video game streaming platform one day, and he was talking about how his coach really isn't the best out there, and we saw Zach LaVine and Jim Boylan get into it. So when not only if you're a hard-nosed coach, but you're getting into it with some of your best players, and they're all young. Most of the guys on this team are young, outside of like Thaddeus Young or Satoransky, but
right.
It's hard to have a coach like that and succeed. So you mentioned that 31.7 quote unquote win percentage. It's kind of hard to want to play for a guy who acts like that when you're not getting those results. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, I definitely agree. The sentiment around the league about this coaching vacancy is that it is one of the more attractive options. I mean, they've got a lot of good young talent. They've had 3 or 4 lottery picks in a row, and they've got another one coming up. So I think there's going to be a lot of coaches wanting this job. Some of the guys that I've heard that they're targeting are Ime Udoka. He's the 76ers assistant coach. Darvin Ham, Wes Unseld Jr., the son of the late great Wes Unseld, and
Phenomenal player in his time.
Right, that outlet pass. Kenny Atkinson is the other one, the former Nets coach. I'd like to see them go after Kenny Atkinson. I think he's, as far as those four guys that I named, I don't know as much about the other three as I do about Atkinson, but he does have a good track record of developing younger players. I think that's something that they could, really take advantage of.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. And when you look at, his track record coming out of Atlanta and then Brooklyn, when they were kind of, asset poor coming off of that, get rich or die trying scheme that they had, trying to get Paul Pierce and Garnett and Jason Terry, the way that Atkinson was able to build up that Brooklyn franchise without very many assets. He went after guys like Dinwiddie, traded for, what's his name? D'Angelo Russell, right? Traded for D'Angelo Russell, developed guys like Karis LeVert, Joe Harris, targeting, Jared Allen in the draft. He shows that he has an eye for young talent. And I think with the vacancies that we're seeing, and we're probably going to see more here in the short term, if you want a development guy, if you're Chicago and you want a development guy, it's probably best that you go ahead and snag him up sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think he'd be a good fit there. I think they're obviously, like we said, they've got a pretty young roster. I think he could do a lot with the talent there. Anything else you wanted to add to it, or?
No, I don't want to talk about Chicago too much. I mean, it's not good news, so we can keep rolling through this little bad news beginning of the show here. Going into Vlade Divac, another guy who was a former, great player in his time with the Lakers and then Sacramento, and then was involved in that Kobe Bryant deal that people don't really talk about that much. But, stepping down after 5 seasons in Sacramento, not a very productive time there. His best season was a 39 win season, and that was overachieving. So it's kind of hard to be excited about anything he did there. They bounced around from coaches like George Karl, Dave Yeager, which I thought that was a premature firing. I thought that he did a great job, and it seemed like it was one of those instances where the team went with the player and DeMarcus Cousins over the coach and Dave Yeager, and now they're without both of them. They have Luke Walton now. I don't suspect that he's going to be there that long since Divac's not there anymore. So with Joe Dumars, who had some success in Detroit, he's kind of polarizing in the executive area right there, right? So it's kind of interesting to see how Dumars is going to come in, and is he going to keep Walton around, especially with the coronavirus, kind of strapping some of these billionaires' assets down a little bit. They're not able to spend as much money. Do you give up some of that guaranteed money that NBA coaches have compared to NBA players?
True. Those are all good points. I like what you said about Joe Dumars being a little bit polarizing. I kind of like the term, if you're not pissing somebody off, you're not doing your job right, especially when it comes to NBA GMs, I think, to a certain extent. I think they always talk about Danny Ainge with the Celtics being one of the best executives, and I know he rubs some people the wrong way too. So I kind of think that's almost a good personality trait to have in that business. This is another one that I wasn't too surprised about. What you said about the coaching changes was spot on. 3 head coaches in 5 years, 2 coaching changes like that. Those were both pretty quick hooks, I feel like. And just the draft blunders, over and over, I feel like, for Sacramento. They've hardly ever drafted well. They took Marvin Bagley when they had the chance at Luka Doncic and Trae Young.
Exactly.
And they got De'Aaron Fox, but still, they
Papa Giannis.
Right. They just haven't acquired talent as well as the rest of the NBA. I don't feel like their front office was probably too good at, finding talent and developing it, obviously, because they haven't been able to do it. Like you said when we were talking about this, half our life that they haven't made the playoffs. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, right. 15 years. I mean, I'm 30. You're 32, right, Austin? Or
Yes,
30 also.
Correct.
Me. You're 30 also.
30 also.
Yeah, so, I mean, literally half of our lives, the Sacramento Kings haven't made the playoffs. And the last time they were in, they lost in the first round. So even the most recent success they had was, a quick exit against San Antonio. Right. And just quick shout out to my buddy Matt Gabb. Appreciate the love, brother. Yeah, it's crazy to think that not only did we see these moves, but he also brought in Peja Stojakovic as an assistant general manager, right? So,
Hmm.
like, what was the demand for bringing in Peja to kind of help out with, these executive decisions? Neither one of these guys seemed like they were, wanting to do any coaching or getting involved in the NBA, executive office. It
Hmm.
just struck me as odd to see the moves that he made, and then trading DeMarcus Cousins for Buddy Hield, right?
Hmm. True. Yeah, I think a lot of that was partially to do with DeMarcus Cousins is a little bit of a head case, and I think they thought he was more trouble than he was worth. I don't agree with that sentiment at all, but I think that's kind of where they went with that. And it was almost like they just decided to kind of dump him for whatever they could get. And what you said about Peja Stojakovic, it almost just seemed like Vlade Divac was giving one of his old teammates and buddies a job. I never, like you said, I never heard his name in coaching circles or anything like that. And whenever you think about players from that era that you could see as executives, he never came up.
Exactly.
It just seemed out of place. I don't know if it's because he's not from the United States, and maybe that's why I feel like it just seems out of place. I don't.
International connection there.
Right.
But then even going off of that, they have an international front office, but they don't take Luka Doncic. They go for another big in Marvin Bagley. That just struck me as odd.
Exactly. They don't even use the advantages that they do have when they have them. And I just think they, every step of the way, they just made the wrong decisions. Um, I don't know. Vlade Divac never really struck me as a guy that took anything that serious either. I just can't see him being like a workaholic, in there pulling those 12-hour days like that job probably entails. I think that definitely makes it hard. I'm excited about Joe Dumars, though. He won a title with the Pistons when he was their GM there. He built a heck of a team there, and he did it kind of an old school way, really without a superstar. It was definitely a whole team effort. It'll be exciting to see what he can do with De'Aaron Fox and Buddy Hield and some of the younger guys that they do have on this team.
Yeah, no doubt. And one thing I just want to touch on real quick before we move on is
Mm-hmm.
that during the reign of Vlade Divac in Sacramento, the Kings went 162 and 238, and they never won more than 39 games in a season. Which the Western Conference is pretty tough. But, that's a lot of stretch to not have much success there. And they performed poorly in the bubble when they had an opportunity, so to speak, to try to get into this play-in tournament. So basically just culminating in a lot of disappointment from Sacramento,
Mm-hmm.
which is, from all accounts, a great basketball area. So you'd like to see them. You'd like to see Joe Dumars do a little bit of something what he did in Detroit, and it'll be interesting, like I said, to see if Luke Walton is the coach there.
Well, from what I've heard so far, at least for next year, he's going to be the coach. They said he's safe for at least next year, so we'll see how that goes.
It's crazy. He needs to start getting his resume for college basketball after next season is all I got to say.
I agree. I think he's much better fit in the college ranks for sure. We got one more coaching change here as the Pelicans fired Alvin Gentry as soon as the bubble ended. I, for one, kind of saw that coming just by the fact that he only had 1 year left on his contract and they hadn't given him an extension. That's usually a pretty good sign that they're going to go in another direction. Plus, with the new front office, he wasn't really their guy. So I kind of saw that coming. I don't know. I think they could have given him a little bit more to work with in the bubble. I think putting that minute restriction on Zion was just, it didn't make sense.
Yeah, it kind of hamstrung him in the playoffs. And I felt like if you were ever going to fire Alvin Gentry, it had to be before the bubble or before this season, right? Because when you're bringing in a very talented guy like Zion Williamson, who is going to be restricted, and that coming into the year, and he got great production out of Lonzo Ball. You saw a great year again from Holiday. Redick had a good season. You saw Brandon Ingram explode this year. By all means, before this year, I was all for firing him. But now I just feel like he was just, it's like a bad mafia movie where, he's the new guy and he's just left in there with all the blame, all the evidence. Prince all belonged to him. And the Pelicans can just shift all the blame his way and move on and try to build a promising franchise.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Stephen. I think he was 100% the fall guy, like you said. I did see it coming, but I didn't necessarily think it was the right move. Like you said, I don't know why you give the guy a year with all these young guys, watch him develop these players the way he did, and then fire him. Not to mention, here's something that I thought was pretty interesting. In his 5 seasons as the Pelicans head coach, he had to use an NBA high 140 different starting lineups. Mostly of that was because of injuries. So he didn't exactly have, his full roster to go to all the time. He's the second winningest coach in franchise history. He's the only coach in franchise history with a winning playoff record. And I think they could have given him one more year, but I just didn't see it coming because of the contract situation and the fact that Tyronn Lue is out there and he's, kind of their GM's guy. They were together in Cleveland. And also, too, I could see them maybe possibly going after Jason Kidd, at least in my mind. I think that he would be a good option to try to help develop Lonzo Ball's game even further. Have a great point guard to teach your hopefully great point guard. I think that's a good idea. But we'll see where it goes. They have a lot of options. They also are looking at Kenny Atkinson and the Nets interim coach Jacques Vaughn. I think
Vaughn would be a great option for any team. I would love to see him get a stab at a coaching vacancy this season.
I think Brooklyn should just go ahead and sign him and keep him.
Yeah, I mean, if they don't, someone else should pick him up.
I agree. But yeah. I would have to think that the Pelicans would be a very, very attractive job with the young talent that they have on their roster. I think we'll get into that a little bit more later in the show.
Sure, and a guy that I think would, just real quick before we move on to our power rankings there, Austin, a guy that I think would be great is Mike D'Antoni, because if you've followed the Rockets and their roller coaster of an offseason from last year on up until today, he still didn't get that extension that he wanted. His agent was very outspoken about, getting a deal done. It didn't happen. The Rockets, they have an injured Russell Westbrook, who we're going to talk about here in a little bit too. It just seems like the writing is on the wall that if, it's basically title or bust for D'Antoni's run as a Rockets head coach for me this season. Mm-hmm. And I think that New Orleans kind of bodes as basically a Phoenix, rebirth, basically, just in terms of like the mythical creature, the Phoenix, and then also the team style that he had in Phoenix with Zion Williamson kind of being that Amare Stoudemire type player, and you have some great young talent around him, and you just kind of grow that roster up.
That's another great point, Stephen. I agree with you. I think Zion could actually play that role even better than Amari did. Obviously, I think the hype around him is a little higher than Amari, but I just mean Amari kind of wanted to play in the post, and D'Antoni's system, he doesn't really want a post guy at all. And I think Zion kind of thrives a little bit more in the open court, on the fast break, obviously. But I think he's a little bit, better with a face-up game, at least at this stage in his career. So I agree with you. I think that would be a good pickup too. It's not somebody I even really thought about. But I do agree with you too. I do think the writing on the wall is on the wall for him, that if they don't win a title this year, that he's probably done in Houston.
Yeah, I agree. And then we'll go ahead and roll into our final power rankings, Austin. I think we had the exact same selection, not just the teams, but also where we had them positioned 1 through 3. So do you want to go ahead and get us started in the East?
Yeah. So our Eastern Conference power rankings, I had Toronto first. They finished 7-1 in the bubble. They beat almost everybody they played. The only loss they had was against Boston. They've looked terrific. Since the season restarted, they've been the best defensive team in basketball. They're deep. They're well coached. What can you say about them? Everything so far has been good. Second, I had the Pacers, and so did you. We had the Pacers second, Indiana. They finished 6-2 in the bubble. They were able to jump all the way up to the 4th spot, and I know there's no home court advantage this year, but still they could have mailed it in without Sabonis and with Oladipo's status up in the air and no Jeremy Lamb, and they've played great. I think they've been a pleasant surprise for sure. And then third, we had Boston. Boston's another team that's extremely deep. They're really good on both sides of the ball. They score like nobody's business. They've got 3 or 4 guys that could easily drop 30 on you in any given night. and they're a top 5 defensive team. They have a great coach. They're young, and they're just going to get better. And they finished 5-3 in the bubble. So yeah, there's our East Power rankings.
Yeah, and I don't really have much else to say other than what my buddy Phil here said, that TJ Warren is the truth. Except for when Jimmy Butler is playing against him, then I would say he might be, stretching the truth a little bit there, right?
Right.
But ultimately, yeah. I mean, Indiana put on a phenomenal show in the bubble, and I'll go ahead and touch on the Western Conference teams since we both had them in order. Phoenix, as heartbreaking as it is that they did not make the bubble. Yeah, I appreciate you there, Phil. As heartbreaking as it was that they didn't make the bubble, it was good just to see them come out there and lay it all on the line. I love the image that you saw after their final game, even when they won and they didn't make it. Monty Williams, who, it seems like he's the type of coach that anyone would run through a brick wall for, right? Where he said, I love you guys, you guys deserve to be in there, and, we're going to get better type thing. So I love that. Monty Williams was our coach of the bubble that we did on another show with the guys at Off the Ball Network. And yeah, next we had Portland, who had a great game today, and we're not going to really cover those today. We're just going to do our Western Conference playoff preview. Wednesday's show we'll kind of get into a little bit more of the nitty gritty of how teams did, but Portland did phenomenal. I mean, they were basically in playoff mode from the very first game. All their games were super close. All their starters played huge minutes, and Dame Lillard gave everybody the business. However many nuggets you wanted, he was giving you 40, 50, 60 pieces. It didn't matter how, bring your family, he's serving them up. And then
fire.
Exactly. And then lastly, we had the Clippers, who for both of the prior weeks was not on there at all, but they were just very steady, consistent throughout the entire bubble. And by the time the dust settled, we both took a sobering look at the standings and who they played. And the Clippers, it was hard to keep them off the list. They beat Denver, Oklahoma City, Dallas, Portland, and New Orleans. Only losses were against Brooklyn and Phoenix, and in Brooklyn, they didn't have everybody. Phoenix, it was just, Devin Booker heroics. There's no other way to put it. They could have had that game. They should have had that game, but because of Devin Booker, they ended up losing that game in a very, very close game. But like I said, it's kind of hard to keep those guys out of the power rankings there.
Right, and I agree for sure. And like you said about the Clippers, they were the only team in the West that was expected to do well, that really showed up and played pretty well. And they didn't have Harrell. So I think that's something to be said. He's coming back. They had some pretty good wins. They only had one fairly bad loss. It wasn't anything too crazy. It wasn't like they got blown out. So yeah, I don't really have much to add. It was fun watching Phoenix, that young team coming together like that with really seemingly nothing to play for. They made it really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, it would be hard pressed for next season if they gave that type of heroics in the bubble in the play-in tournament, that they would be left out, because as we know, the NBA originally wanted to do the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th seeds in a play-in tournament, which would have been a more appropriate, format for the term tournament, right? As opposed to 2 teams and 2 games. Speaking of which, Austin, why don't we just go ahead and do a quick little recap of how the very quick play-in tournament went?
Yeah, for sure. I'll go ahead and start it if you don't mind. I actually was kind of expecting Memphis to come out and win the first game. I think just because I wanted to see more basketball, back-to-back games. I was excited about that. And they almost pulled it off.
They did.
Both teams played really well. Ja Morant showed why everybody thinks he's a future superstar. And like you said, Damian Lillard's just been unbelievable. How many ever points his team needs. He's answered the call every single game. And CJ McCollum came back in a big way. He seems like his back's doing better. So that's a positive for them for sure. Memphis played really, really well without Jaren Jackson, without Justice Winslow, no Tyus Jones. They didn't play that well in the bubble, but they showed up. And something to be said about that. I think next year they're definitely a playoff contender for sure. I think they've got a good young core. But who in the West do you take out of the playoffs to put them in?
Especially with Golden State coming back and Phoenix looking to get better, and
San Antonio's not going to be bad for long.
Yeah, and then I mean, you could expect, a team. I feel like Sacramento is going to take an even bigger step back next year. My sneaky suspicion, and I don't want it to be true because I very much enjoyed watching Memphis this year. To me, they're the team on the outside looking in next year that, they may make the play-in tournament, but I don't think that they're going to be an 8th seed next
Yeah,
season either. So
it's definitely tough. Going to be tough.
it is because of how young they are. They're still got to figure out which way they want to go as for in terms of contracts and things like that. They were a really good team. I projected that they would win that first game, and the only reason I projected Portland winning the first game is because they're going to run into a buzzsaw of the Los Angeles Lakers, and they probably wanted to win that game so they could have that added rest. They're not going to play again until tomorrow. Today is Monday as of this recording. If you're listening or watching later as opposed to live, we're recording this on Monday, so that added rest, especially with the big minutes that the Blazers starters are getting, I felt like Portland was going to come in there and just try to handle business, and it was a lot closer than I had anticipated, and that made for probably the most excited I have ever been for who made an 8 seed. I couldn't believe that it was like I got, conned into watching bad basketball almost, because it was like, this is like one of the best games I've ever seen. And it was like, oh, okay, but it's for the 8th seed. I feel like I got kind of bamboozled into caring about who made the 8th seed.
Well, I think you and I have kind of touched on that as we've gone, as this bubble has gone along, and the play-in scenario has, come into focus a little bit. Like you said, it's for the 8th seed. It's not like they're going to be in the NBA Finals. They still have
not
to
even a playoff game.
They still have to play LeBron. They still have to play AD. They're still meeting the Lakers in the first round. It's still going to be tough for them to move on from there. And I think Adam Silver's a genius because, like you said, everybody is glued to their television over a game that doesn't even really mean that much. But they made it seem like it did, and it made it much more exciting. And I, for one, loved seeing Carmelo Anthony hit that big three towards the end of the game there. I've always liked Carmelo.
I haven't always liked Carmelo, but I do appreciate I haven't disliked him to the point to where I was glad to see him go, but I was certainly not a big Melo guy. And I feel like what the Melo you're seeing now is the Melo that everyone's always wanted, that team first Carmelo Anthony. Because, and it's hard to balance that, right? It's hard to be the most talented offensive guy on your team when you're prime Melo and then also be a team guy. We see plenty of people struggle with that, right? But the Melo we're seeing now is he kind of exemplifies, the type of player that I love watching, a super talented guy, but very much team first. He's basically their Gordon Hayward, you know what I mean? Like where he's an all-star, super talented guy, potentially an all-NBA talent, and now he's on a team where there's a couple guys that are actually better than he is, so he kind of has to get in and where he fits in and, not be the reason they crumble, basically.
Right, and I think the mistake that Houston made and the mistake that Oklahoma City made was they tried to turn him into just a standstill three-point shooter. They put him out on the corner, they put him on the wing, and told him he was going to take all of his shots from three, and he took way more threes than he ever had before in his career. And he's a decent three-point shooter, but that's not really his game. Right. And it's hard for a guy like Carmelo, I think, to age well in the NBA because he is a ball dominant. They call him a ball stopper. He kind of plays that old school hero ball style.
Yeah, the ball sticks to his hands.
It's a lot.
He waits a couple seconds.
Yeah. But that can work as the focal point of your second unit. And it can work for 20 minutes a night or 25 minutes a night. It's not probably going to work for him anymore for 36, 37 minutes a night as the focal point of your offense. But he can be a great first option on your bench unit for sure.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. But, to speak to a point that you just made real quick before we move on to the Western Conference preview there, he is basically the same. He basically does have that same role that Oklahoma City and Houston was trying to get him, and you're right, Phil. It has been a renaissance of sorts for Carmelo Anthony there. He basically just embraced the role, I think, for the first time in his career, whereas in Oklahoma City, he wasn't really feeling it. And then in Houston, it seemed like a situation where they were telling him one thing and then doing another, and it didn't last very long. And we saw Carmelo basically have a year off, and now he's in the best shape that he's been in a long, long time. We have skinny Melo back now for the first time in years. And I just think that he got humbled. And a lot of people are like, everybody said he was washed. I don't always agree with Max Kellerman, but I feel like you kind of have to take his side on this. You kind of had to evaluate Melo where he was at that moment. You know what I mean? Like, he was not in Oklahoma City and in Houston. He was not that New York, Denver Melo. He was not that same guy. And it seemed like he just wasn't happy where he was, and he couldn't embrace that role that they were trying to give him. And when the NBA basically said, all right, Melo, you're not going to be on a roster, which I didn't agree with. I didn't think that he was the same Melo, but he was certainly talented enough to make an NBA roster, right? Mm-hmm. I think that he kind of had to deal with that, emotionally and mentally, taking that step down in a role and accepting, like, hey, if I really want to do the best that I can for a team, this is the role that I have to take, and I have to be a star in this role as opposed to being a star on a team.
Right. That's a good point. Don't forget, too, he was a member of the Atlanta Hawks and never even played a game. So that's saying something, too. They cut him as soon as they got him. I don't think I would be too excited about that, if I was Carmelo, a team as bad as Atlanta, just saying flat out that they didn't want him, basically.
Right, yeah, that had to really hurt his pride, because it's not like Atlanta was really doing much this year anyway, right? So
right.
They had Vince Carter, and Vince Carter gave him spot minutes throughout the season. So
right.
I don't know. Like I said, I'm glad that he's doing well for the Portland Trail Blazers. And speaking of the Portland Trail Blazers, we can go ahead and get started with our Western Conference preview there, Austin, before we get into our new segment, which I'm very excited about. We're basically going to be taking an NBA team and running down how would we fix that team, and we'll be doing that for the teams as they get eliminated through the playoffs.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about that too, but let's go ahead and talk about these Western Conference playoffs first. The first matchup we're going over is the Lakers and Portland, as we've already talked about it. The Lakers got the 1 seed in the West, and Portland was able to fight their way into that 8th seed. And one thing that's kind of bothering me about this matchup, and I think you to a certain extent have expressed this too, everybody that on Twitter and Facebook and around the NBA are so big on Portland right now. They're so high on them. I've seen so many people pick them to go to the Western Conference Finals. They're not going to beat the Lakers. They had to have incredible performances game after game from Damian Lillard to barely beat some teams that are towards the bottom of the playoffs. That definitely aren't the Lakers. So, I just think the bad matchup of the Lakers not being able to guard Portland's guards is overblown, because Portland can't guard anybody anyway either.
That's a good point.
So I think this series is going to go quickly, and the point you made about wanting to get as much rest as possible, I think is going to be a big storyline throughout these entire playoffs. So looking at that schedule, every team is playing every other night, like whole week. And there's no travel time, there's no breaks. And so I think teams are going to want to try to win in 4 or 5 games as quickly as they can, not let it drag out. So I see the Lakers honestly maybe losing a game to Portland.
And one thing I just want to speak to, when you're talking about trying to finish these series up as much as possible, one thing that we have to remember is that the NBA was very adamant in that they were saying that, hey, as these games and series finish up sooner, we're going to try to move the next round up as soon as we can and kind of fast forward through these meaningless open rounds, basically. You know what I mean? So it's going to be hard to kind of figure out, okay, do we want to run through it too quick and then ramp up and run right into Houston? Or do we just maybe take a scheduled loss in the playoffs, you know what I mean, and kind of keep, our legs underneath us? I don't think that'll happen, but I could imagine that at least being a discussion when you're talking to, organizations within the NBA.
I think that's definitely a plausible scenario for sure. I think that's something that they've probably talked about. I just think, with LeBron's track record in the first round, I think he's going out there to win every game, and he's going to play as hard as he can. I think the Blazers being without Trevor Ariza and Rodney Hood is going to hurt them a lot. They just don't have enough on the wings to slow down. They don't have
a wing stopper at all.
Right. And the Lakers are an extremely big, physical, athletic. They're fast too. As for being an older team, they are one of the faster teams in the NBA. They score a pretty high percentage of their points on the fast break, and that's something that Portland doesn't do well against. But don't get me wrong, Damian Lillard is more than good enough to steal a game for Portland for sure.
I see this game. I honestly think that this is a 6 game matchup because it's so dynamic. It's so, they're such diametrically opposed teams where you talk about, that athletic front court for the Lakers and then the dynamic backcourt for the Blazers, and the Lakers don't have Avery Bradley. They won't have him. At some point, they're expecting Rajon Rondo. They actually have him listed as day to day. So we'll kind of see when they employ him and for how long and things like that. Maybe he kind of takes this opening series as a, to get reacclimated with his teammates and things like that. It's, I don't know. I think that Portland has enough to make this a 6 game matchup. A lot of people are picking like a 5 game series in this one. And to me, I mean, I'm not going to get into a big argument against somebody over a game for the losing team. But I think that the Blazers do have enough to go 6 games because the Lakers really haven't performed that well offensively in this bubble scenario. And you can kind of, you can shrug that off if you want. It's hard just to ramp that up because although they are an old team and they do have LeBron James who can quote unquote activate playoff mode at any given moment, this is their first year together. And we also got to consider, too, that if Nurkic is out there, I don't see Anthony Davis matching up against Nurkic because he's almost 300 pounds and he's skilled enough to be out there on the court because he's a playmaking big. He's shown that he has range already in the bubble. So I don't see Davis matching up against Nurkic when you have guys like McGee and Howard on the Lakers roster.
Right, but I think that's why McGee and Howard are so important because they can put those guys out there and they can take that pounding, for half the game or 3/4 of the game and let Anthony Davis play power forward a little bit more. The Lakers' best lineup is with Anthony Davis at center, and I think they will go to that more in the playoffs. But I don't want to talk too much more about this. If you want my pick, I'm taking the Lakers in a sweep. Honestly, I think they're going to sweep the Portland Trailblazers. I'll go ahead out on a limb and say it.
I mean that's all good. I got Lakers in 6, and we'll go ahead and bounce from one LA team to the other. They actually have their first game here in just 3 hours roughly with the Los Angeles Clippers versus the Dallas Mavericks. Historically speaking, just for this season, the Clippers are 3-0 against the Mavericks this year with victories looking like 126-111, 110-107, and 114-99. The Mavericks are without Dwight Powell, Willie Cauley-Stein, Jalen Brunson, and Courtney Lee. And I just, this is a bad matchup for Luka Doncic and Kristaps Porzingis' first time having any sort of playoff look. You know what I mean? It's just a bad matchup for them.
Oh, definitely. The Clippers are probably the deepest team in the NBA. They've got obviously the reigning Finals MVP in Kawhi Leonard, which, by the way, if you really look at the numbers other than assists, Kawhi and Luka's statistics aren't that far off, and Kawhi is a significantly better defender. So I agree with you where you said about it being a bad matchup. They've got Paul George too. Montrezl Harrell's coming back. They've got a lot of big athletic defenders that can, throw a lot of different looks at you. They can throw a lot of different guys out there at you. They're another team that has 3 or 4 guys that can easily score 20, 25 points in a game. The Mavericks looked all right in the bubble. I don't think they set the world on fire, but they weren't terrible. And we know they can score. They can definitely light it up. I just think the Clippers have too much star power. They're too good defensively. And I just think it's not the Mavs. I think it's coming. I think they're an extremely talented team, but I just think it's a little ways off yet.
Yeah, they got to add some defense. They got guys on this team. Who are you putting on Kawhi and Paul George? Do you try to put, Dorian Finney-Smith on Kawhi and then maybe Tim Hardaway Jr. on Paul George? You're getting overmatched either way. Kristaps Porzingis who is he checking in this game? We don't know when we're going to see Montrezl Harrell back. Is he going to be trying to keep up with Marcus Morris standing on the outside? Because that's not really going to bode well because he's more of a rim protector than he is a one-on-one stopper. So depending on who you have out there, even JaMychal Green, same thing, right? If he's playing small ball center for the Clippers, you're taking Kristaps Porzingis away from protecting that rim, and you're giving, Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, and even, Lou Williams, a runway to the ramp without anybody there to stop him.
Oh, yeah, I agree for sure. I think the Mavericks are a team that you can get physical against and kind of, out muscle in certain aspects. Not that, they're pushovers, but Kristaps Porzingis isn't exactly an intimidating interior defender. He is a good shot blocker.
He's a good help defender.
Right. And I think he's somebody, though, if you go at him and, take it right at him and go hard, I think you can exploit his physical weakness. Not that he's not strong, but I mean, he's obviously so skinny. He's not a Joel Embiid. He's not a, Rudy Gobert. He's not somebody that's going to completely change the way you try to attack on offense. And Luka's not a great defender. He's serviceable. He tries, but he's not Patrick Beverley by any means. Right. And I just think it's like you said, it's not a good matchup. Almost anybody else other than the Clippers or the Lakers, I think they'd have a lot better chances this year. But as it happened, those two teams I think are head and shoulders above everybody else in the West. And I mean, I'm not as confident with the Clippers in this one. I think they'll lose a game. I think it'll be 4-1. I think Luka and KP will get a game from them for sure, but I could see this being a sweep too, just as easily.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on that 4-1. And another guy to keep an eye on for the Mavericks is Maxi Kleber. How much are they going to try to run a Kleber, KP, Luka Doncic, pick and roll with one of those guys in the corner to kind of spread things out for the Clippers defense. Even still, you got too much defense. You could have, Kawhi Leonard or Paul George on either one of those guys for extended period, either of those guys on Doncic for an extended period of time. And he's basically the offense. We've talked about this a little bit, Austin, where the Dallas Mavericks still have to figure out the best way to implement a successful Luka Doncic, Kristaps Porzingis team. They both look good away from each other, but on the court, it's basically the Luka show with Kristaps Porzingis spotted up in the corner.
Right, I agree for sure. I think it doesn't play to KP's strengths that Luka is so ball dominant. But I mean, who's going to tell Luka to take the ball out of his hands? You know what I mean? He's terrific. Yeah. So they're going to have to figure something out there, or it's not looking quite as good of a fit of a pairing as it may have seemed from the get go. It's almost kind of another thing like Embiid and Simmons in Philadelphia. Like those are two guys. I don't want to get too off topic.
Sure.
Those are two guys that don't really seem to match up like as well as everybody thought they would. They kind of clog the court for each other, and it's almost the opposite for Luka and KP. It almost seems like when Luka's out there, KP's not aggressive enough and just kind of stands back. Whereas in Philadelphia, it's like Embiid and Simmons just clog into each other and get in each other's way. So I just think they'll definitely, like you said, have to figure out the best way to deploy both of them together because, they need their best lineups to have both of those guys out there.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. And I think that we both come to the same conclusion that both LA teams are opening up with pretty significant victories there. Now, this next matchup, Austin, we have the Denver Nuggets and the Utah Jazz. Now, as of this recording, they already played earlier, and it was a phenomenal game. The Nuggets stole a game in a very, 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 very impressive effort from Donovan Mitchell in this game. 57 points in a losing effort. It was pretty nip-tuck throughout most of the game. A lot of lead changes, but went into overtime, and that's when Jamal Murray just exploded.
Right. And I think, like you said, Jamal Murray, I think he's one of the more underrated guards in the NBA. I've been really high on him ever since he came out of Kentucky. I watched him a lot in college, and I remember those Kentucky teams. It always seemed like nobody really stood out just because they had so many stars. They just didn't get enough minutes or enough touches. But he always did. He always was able to fill it up. He lit up the scoreboard in college. He's done it in Denver. And, obviously Donovan Mitchell did his best Damian Lillard impression. It just wasn't good enough. And I'm sure he's got to be thinking, what more can I do to get a win? And I think that might have been their best chance to win a game. They might still get one or two. I don't know. I don't know that the Nuggets are overwhelmingly that much better than Utah. I haven't been too impressed with them since the season restarted. But obviously, like you said, and like they showed, Donovan Mitchell played his played out of his mind.
Yeah.
But it still wasn't enough. So what can they do to get a win?
Well, it's hard, right? Because they're without Bogdanovich for the rest of their time. Mike Conley Jr. actually left the bubble today for the birth of his child, so congratulations. And, you know, we have to remember we got to be easy on these guys. It's not like he was being selfish for leaving. You know,
Right.
they planned around what they thought would be a regular NBA season, and this year, like, just like everybody else's life, it kind of screwed up whatever best laid plans were in place on his part, right?
Right.
But you know, rightfully so, left the bubble for the birth of his child. And then the Nuggets, they didn't play Gary Harris or Will Barton. They're going to be looking to implement those guys again. But even before all these injuries and people leaving for babies and stuff like that, the Nuggets were 3-0 against the Jazz this season, but all of them were very close games. They won the Nuggets won a 134 to 132 double overtime game earlier in the year. They beat them 98 to 95 and then 106 to 100, which was the biggest, you know, point spread between these teams and all the games that they had against each other this year. So, you know, you would look at that 3-0 record and be like, oh, okay, the Nuggets have handled the Jazz. It's just that they just so happened to edge them out every game, and today was just another, you know, machination of that.
Right. And one thing that I think about all the time is imagine how good the Nuggets could be if they ever get healthy. I mean, we've never seen this team really at full capacity. Gary Harris has been injury prone. Michael Porter Jr. missed his entire rookie year. You know, just think if they get, you know, a big series from Michael Porter Jr. and
Murray and Jokic.
Thank you. Yes. So, you know, I don't think we've seen the best Denver team yet. And I think the Jazz this year, they're obviously not the defensive team that they've been in the past. And I think that's going to come back to bite them. And I think that actually gives them worse chances to advance in the playoffs. I think they should have doubled down on their defensive prowess instead of making. They've made some moves to try to get rid of some defensive guys and bring in a little more scoring, which, you know, in today's NBA, can't have enough scoring. But I just think going the other way is what worked for them, and I think that was their identity, and I think they kind of lost that this year.
Yeah, well, I mean, even in this game, right, Royce O'Neal got into a lot of foul trouble, and he's kind of one of their better defenders. And Joe Ingles struggled a little bit to guard some of the perimeter players here on the team. And outside of those two, Mike Conley, for as bad as he's been offensively for large stretches of the year, you know, defensively, he was still the same Mike Conley. So it hurts when you're losing these guys and then you're counting on guys who barely got any play at all in the regular season to give you meaningful playoff minutes against the third best team record wise in the Western Conference. But they made it a game, and that's what was pretty impressive to me.
I think that's been Utah's calling card for a few years now. Is you don't see them get blown out a lot. They always they keep it close. They play close games. They just tend to fall short. I'm not really sure why that is, but I've never been too impressed with the Jazz, this iteration of the Jazz at least. And this is another series that I'm pretty confident isn't going to go more than at most 6 games. I think it'll be done in 5 too. I'm not too big on the Jazz winning more than about a game.
Yeah, I think that I think that this one could be another 6-game matchup just because historically speaking, all these games were close. You know, the Nuggets extended their spread to 4-0 from the beginning of this year on into the playoffs. I think that the Jazz have enough, right? Anytime that you can, it's also gut wrenching too to have your best player put up 57 in a loss, right? So,
right.
I think that this could be, you know, another 5-6 game, but I think that Denver takes this one ultimately, and I think that that's what you were speaking to earlier, Austin. That Denver's going to walk away the victor in this series.
Definitely.
All right, and wrapping up the last one, this may be the most fun of all the matchups in both conferences, right? The 4-5. You know, we have Houston taking on the Oklahoma City Thunder in a revenge game in a lot of ways, you know, or a revenge series, so to speak, right? The Rockets are actually 1-2 against the Thunder this year. 116 to 112 was their only victory, and then their losses were, you know, 92 to Oklahoma's 113, and then 107 to Oklahoma's 112. And this actually did have the small ball iteration of the Rockets in later in the season, so that's something to consider. I know that a lot of people will say, well, that was before Houston implemented the small ball. Actually, the Thunder did get a game in there against the small ball lineup. and Steven Adams to give up some big minutes there. So that's kind of, is Houston too fast and too skilled to take out, the traditional Oklahoma City lineup, or is Oklahoma just too skilled 1 through 5 for that to even matter against the Rockets?
Well, those are both good questions. I think this is a really intriguing matchup. Honestly, I think the Thunder match up as good as just about anybody against Houston. Like, they do rely a lot on Steven Adams, but I think they need to try to exploit the mismatch the other direction as much as they can as well. Not just let it be a negative on their side. But I think they've got a lot of, athletic, physical wing defenders. They've got a lot of good guards that defend really well. I think the last thing Chris Paul needs is a chip on his shoulder.
Right.
I think he probably is going to have one with going against his former team, and James Harden specifically. And obviously the injury to Russell Westbrook kind of changes things for me big time as well.
Yeah.
I think if he was healthy, this is just the Rockets are one of the more lethal offensive teams in the NBA when they're hitting on all cylinders. But you see how much harder their offense is and how much harder the game is on James Harden when Westbrook's not out there. He takes a lot of that pressure off of Harden. And without him in there, I think the Thunder actually steal this series. If he comes back and is, 80, 90% healthy and can play the majority of the series, I think maybe Houston could pull it out. But I do think this is going to be 7 games. I have the Thunder winning in 7 games. I think, they've got a great coach, as we've talked about. I picked him for Coach of the Year. And obviously Chris Paul is, like you said, one of the all-time best point guards. So I just think this is a tough matchup for the Rockets. I think they are a matchup nightmare for just about anybody else other than the Thunder.
Right, and it's hard with that clutch lineup that Oklahoma City sports with the 3 guards there with Schroeder, Chris Paul, and then SGA out there. I don't know. I feel like if Westbrook is healthy, I feel like that makes the series enough for me to go with Houston, because he's so dynamic. I don't think Chris Paul can't guard both of those players. Like, that's the thing. And SGA, as much as I've loved the strides that he's made, he's not the type of guy that can really stop an athletic, playmaking, big perimeter playmaker. He's not really that guy yet. And, which one do you want Chris Paul to guard more? Probably James Harden, if I was to pick one for him to stick to. And then you just got to hope that SGA can stay in front of Westbrook, which, I mean, good luck. Hardly anybody can, right? And
True.
I just think that they're so dynamic in that lineup and defensively, right? We've seen Houston actually has done a decent job with this small ball lineup playing defense. I think that you probably have James Harden up against a Danilo Gallinari and actually doing a good job, because he's been up against Giannis and KP, among other, Al Horford, guys that he should have no business covering, and he's actually doing a decent job up against them. So I think that if you have Westbrook, that makes it a Houston victory for me, probably in 6, maybe 7 games. But I don't. If Westbrook's out, it's hard for James Harden to come up big against a very talented starting 5 with a little bit of depth for Oklahoma City.
Well, yeah, and a couple things too is, Harden and Westbrook are 2 of the best rebounding guards in the NBA today, and really Westbrook's one of the best rebounding guards ever. So that kind of helps with what you were saying about their defense with those small ball lineups, is they don't really give up a lot on the boards thanks to those guys. And I think what they did is exactly what Utah didn't do the last couple of seasons, and they've doubled down on who they are. Instead of adding another piece around James Harden, they said, hey, let's get another guy that can handle the ball and be the focal point if we need him to be. That way we have 2 elite, dynamic ball handlers that can initiate the offense, basically switch off, take some of the pressure off of Harden. And then obviously when they went to this micro ball lineup, small, extra small, whatever you want to call it, I think again,
medium.
Right. I think, again, they went all in on their identity and who they are, because, I mean, at the end of the day, that's what's going to win it for them. They're either they're going to do it their way or it's not going to work. So
yeah, and there's a lot of questions here. I think if things are the way that they are right now and they stay that way, Oklahoma City does take it. I just think that Westbrook is that dynamic enough to make life super difficult for anybody on Oklahoma City, even Chris Paul you know, for what it's worth. I think that he even gives Chris Paul some some problems on that side of the ball too.
I agree wholeheartedly,
And
100%.
and also you have to consider, as great as a defender as Chris Paul is, if he's guarding these two guys, these guys draw some of the most fouls in the NBA.
Mhm.
So how much do you want to put on Chris Paul on the defensive end to maybe even foul out of a game or two,
Right,
you
that's a good
know,
point too. That's the thing.
or not to be that aggressive on the defensive end as to not foul out,
Mhm.
you know.
Very true. I think, honestly, I think it's going to be the most exciting series. I think it's going to be the closest, and really, I had to pick at least one upset. So,
I mean, you have to, right, at some point. I'm saving my upsets for the second round if everything goes,
fair enough.
you
Fair
know,
enough.
according to plan. But now, Austin, we get to roll into a segment that I'm very excited about. This was an idea that I thought me and you kind of collaborated on and came up with a really good idea. Austin, how on earth do we fix the New Orleans Pelicans?
Well, I think there's obviously, looking at our notes, there's multiple different ways you could go about it. I don't think they're that far off, and I think a lot of people think that way as well. Obviously, the NBA front office wanted them in the playoffs, if you ask me. I think they wanted that LeBron Zion matchup. But they have a lot of options. They are going to be kind of up against the salary cap, but they do have some wiggle room here and there. Their current roster that's going to be under contract for next year is Lonzo Ball, Nikhil Alexander-Walker, Josh Hart, Zion Williamson, J.J. Redick, Jackson Hayes, Nicolo Melli, and Jrue Holiday. They would also have Brandon Ingram as a restricted free agent and a non-guaranteed contract of Darius Miller for $7 million. They're free agents that they could either denounce or re-sign. I already said Brandon Ingram, Frank Jackson, Zillin Cheatham, Etuan Moore, Jaleel Okafor, Kenrick Williams, Josh Gray, Derek Favors.
Yeah, and Moore and Derek Favors are their unrestricted free agents, right? So they don't have any way to claim these guys if there's a bidding war for the services of Etuan Moore or Derek
The only thing they have going for him with Derek Favors is they do have his bird rights, so they can go over the cap to sign him, which I think, I'll get into it, but I think that's a big part of why I think they will re-sign him. But that contract of Darius Miller's, it's basically worthless to them if he's not healthy, and once it becomes guaranteed, because as of right now they can't trade him for any financial value. So I think it's best that they just move on from him, cut him. That opens up that $7 million. Obviously, they already fired their coach. That was the first move that I had them making. So we'll skip that one. I changed that to either sign Jason Kidd or Kenny Atkinson. Those are my picks. And then I think their first move that they need to make, and I think you'll agree, is they have to re-sign Brandon Ingram.
Yeah, I think that we just kind of disagree with how much money they probably go in and offer him. It's not by very much money when we're talking in terms of NBA contracts, at least, right?
Right. I just went with that 27.2 figure because that looks like it's going to be the max that they can offer him. And I think, in today's NBA, Brandon Ingram is a max player, his max extension. I don't know if he's a super max guy down the road, but $27.2 million a year for him is not outrageous, especially considering that's almost what they're paying Jrue Holiday right now. And not that he's a bad player, but that's a lot of money for Jrue Holiday. So I went with 5 years, $136 million. It's $27.2 million annually. Just signing him, that actually puts them over the salary cap, the projected salary cap already.
Right.
So we're looking at luxury tax penalty and trying to stay out of there.
Well, I mean, so just for people watching and listening right now, once you go over the cap, that doesn't necessarily mean you get into the luxury tax, so to speak, right? Like you still have another layer before you start worrying about getting luxury tax. And the good thing for the Pelicans is that they won't have the repeater tax, right? Because of their previous previous salaries and whatnot.
Yeah, and small market teams like New Orleans can't handle paying that repeater penalty tax like you were talked about, and more often than not, they try to stay out of the luxury tax altogether.
Right.
And from what I've been reading,
especially if they're not competing for a title.
Right, exactly. From what I've been reading, that luxury tax line is going to be about 132.7 million.
Mm-hmm.
So with bird rights of a couple players and with some exceptions that they have, they can add some pieces to the roster. Not a ton, but they can make some moves. Which is why I actually went with a trade as my biggest move to try to kind of, fast track their rebuild, if so to speak. I actually have them trying to trade for Bradley Beal. I know he just signed an extension in Washington, but they had a pretty awful year. They were the worst team defensively in the NBA. He was actually graded out as the second worst defender in basketball.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think obviously a change of scenery, I think will help that some, because of a lot of what people were saying was that he wasn't even trying on defense. And I mean, that happens to guys sometimes when they're in a bad situation.
And when they're the only offensive option, too.
Exactly. So the trade that I went with, and you tell me what you think. I don't know. It might be a little far-fetched. I have Jrue Holiday, the first-round pick that they got from the Lakers in the Anthony Davis trade in 2021, their own first-round pick in 2022, and then I threw in 2 of the second-round picks they have. They actually have 10 second-round picks in the next 4 years. So they have a lot of draft capital to try to make a move. And I think 4 picks and a solid player in Jrue Holiday would be enough to get Bradley Beal from Washington. And I could even see them adding in another pick if they really needed to. But then that gives the Pelicans 3 legitimate scoring threats, 3 pretty much all-star talents. Zion, obviously. If you ask me, I think Zion is the next absolute superstar. I think he's going to be the guy in the next 5 years. So I think trying to win now, trying to maximize this window that they have with him while he's still, on a team-friendly contract, I think is the way to go. So I have them making that move. I think that's something that you and I kind of differed on, if you want to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, sure. And real quick, before I get into like the big moves that I think that the Pelicans should make, I just want to go over their draft assets that they have.
Yeah, for sure. Set it up, definitely.
Yeah, this year they have their own first rounder. Their seconds, they have their own Milwaukee and Washington, which they got in a trade with Milwaukee. So they're going to have a couple of really good second rounders this year. Next year they have their own, and then they have the Lakers if it's 1 through 7, right? And if not, then that carries over to 2022. Their seconds, they have their own or Chicago. Chicago has trade rights for that, right? And then they have another Washington Wizards second rounder, and Cleveland. So next year they have 3 really good seconds, it looks like, right? Or 2, and then Chicago's got another really good second. In 2022 they have their own, and then LA's if it didn't carry over from the previous year. They have their own second rounder, and then another Cleveland in 2022, so another good second. In 2023 they have their own or LA's. Their second, they have their own second rounder for 2023 if it goes from 31 to 45. They have Atlanta's if it falls from 46 to 60, and then another Washington second rounder. In 2024 they have their own or Los Angeles, which they could defer to 2025 depending on the draft class there. And then they have their own second rounder. In 2025, like I said, they have their own, and then LA's if they want to defer to that season, and then their own. And then the last one that they have on the books is 2026, where they have their own first and their own second, right? So a whole bunch of draft picks. I don't see them making a move for a guy like Bradley Beal when you have other teams like the Brooklyn Nets, who, normally it's not only if it works for the team, right, but if it's what the player wants to. You see, right, teams kind of bend to the will of what a player wants. They'll give them a couple places. I don't think that Bradley Beal, with where he is age-wise, is appropriate for that timeline. Not that I don't think that he wouldn't be a great fit there, but then I also kind of question too, how does a John Wall and Jrue Holiday backcourt look like for Washington, right? They're not going to be as dynamic of a scoring team to me with that, right?
True.
I already mentioned earlier that I think that hiring Mike D'Antoni would be a great signing for head coaching there, because although he has never gotten a team to the finals or anything like that, he has shown that he can develop players, especially young ones, and
Mm-hmm.
empowering them and their skill sets and things like that. So he's a successful head coach. He's not a terrible one, right? But he's also not that great of one. So I think he kind of fits a roster like this very well.
Well, don't forget too. If I think he got robbed in that Sun Spurs series back in the mid 2000s when they had that benches
Robert
clearing thing
Horry,
and that those
yeah.
suspensions, I think they got robbed. They would have been in the finals that year, and that could have completely changed the narrative on his career. Because I do think he is
Exactly.
good. I do think he is a good coach.
Yeah, you could see him having kind of like an Andy Reid, of sorts, how he did in the NFL.
Right.
You could see D'Antoni doing something similar to that with a roster like this.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I think bringing Brandon Ingram back for a 5 year, I said 125 million, just to kind of help with luxury tax, and I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's enough for a guy like Brandon Ingram, who's going to get the keys to the team anyway.
Right.
Basically, even though Zion's there, he's going to be their perimeter creator.
Mm-hmm.
I think that he does, and I disagree. I think you let Favors walk, because I think that if he stays, he's going to get a bigger contract as opposed to where he would anywhere else, right? And then obviously you let guys like Cheatham, Okafor, and Gray all go. I think that you try to bring back each one more for like a 2 year, 5 million team option if you can. Re-sign Kendrick Williams to a 3 year, 9 million team option if you can, and then Frank Jackson for your backup point guard, 3 years, 9 million. And since he's restricted, another team could try to make a bid on him. If he gets too expensive, obviously you just let him walk. What
Right.
I'm really interested in seeing is what you think they should do draft wise.
Well, you and I actually talked about that a little bit, and I do want to give you props on your awesome big board that you've created. I can tell
Oh,
you
thank you.
you put a lot of work into it. I think their own first round pick is going to fall somewhere around like 12 to 14, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and the lottery actually comes this Thursday, so we'll have a more definite
Nice.
idea of where they're going to be picking here later on in the week.
Right.
But it's largely believed, based on the odds, that they're going to stick around 12.
And I think a lot of factors go into it. Starting off with the fact that they're going to have such an abbreviated offseason. I don't think you're going to see as many picks changing hands and as many trades leading up to the draft, because from what we're hearing, the draft's going to be like 3 days after the end of the finals.
Right.
So they're not going to have much time for a lot of wheeling and dealing. So I kind of think it depends on what path they choose, because I could completely see them going with what you said and not making a trade and keeping all those draft assets, because they are going to have to pay Ingram, they are going to have to pay Zion, they are going to have to pay Lonzo Ball, who just by the nature of being the second overall pick is probably going to get more money than you'd really want to pay him, but he's going to get a big contract from somebody. And Josh Hart too is somebody I think that they want to keep. So it'd be a good way to keep costs down, keep all those picks, have all those second rounders, on smaller contracts. And it would be a good way to keep things under control. But ultimately, if they did make a trade or were planning on making a trade for someone like Brad Beal, I think, wing help is never a mistake in the draft. I think athletic wings that can defend and can stretch the floor is kind of the name of the game. If they lose Derek Favors, I'd like to see him go after another big guy. Specifically, I haven't looked at it a ton. The guy from Villanova, Sadiq Bey.
Oh, Bay is a nice get. I'm really big on Bay's game. I think that he would be a good grab.
Right, and he seems like the prototypical size and athleticism for a wing player in the NBA, and he is a little bit older. He's got experience. Those guys from Villanova tend to pan out. They've been pretty good.
Yeah, no doubt. I think, though, we kind of differ, obviously in the path that they take as far as free agency goes, too. I felt like they probably want to go with a little bit more of another either shot creator or a perimeter defender, right? So guys that I would like to see them target if they're available. I know some of these guys you're going to hear and be like, how on earth are they going to be available at 12? It's the draft. You never know. We see people fall all the time. And I wouldn't be surprised if you saw a Tyrese Halliburton and RJ Hampton and Isaac Okoro or even Josh Green out of Arizona. If either of those guys fall to 12, all these guys, with the exception of Okoro, can get their own shot off. And then if you get Okoro, you have another wing defensive-minded player to where you could, have him either be the 3 or the 4 and kind of swap out with Ingram, so you kind of have a more contemporary NBA lineup.
Well, I think they'd be, celebrating all night long if Halliburton fell all the way to 12. I think that'd definitely be a great, pickup for them. I think he's somebody that a lot of NBA teams are pretty high on, and I wouldn't be surprised if he went even higher than people are saying now. I could see him being a top 4 or 5 pick, really, if it falls the right way. Now, there is going to be no combine. There's not as much scouting time, so I think that too could play into whether or not they keep all these draft picks, because they're not going to have as much opportunity to really scout these second round talents, and they're not going to know as much about them. And I think nothing scares professional teams more than the unknown.
Sure.
And I think they tend to shy away from that a lot. That's another reason I kind of saw them maybe packaging some of their picks together to try to, speed up this rebuild, like I said. And I would agree with what you said about Bradley Beal's age not really fitting with that timeline if it weren't for the fact that I think Zion makes a difference there. I think with him playing a full season healthy, I think he's already there. You know what I mean? I don't think he's going to have to get a whole lot better to already be a superstar. And the Derek Favors thing,
offensively, I would agree with you. Defensively, he still has a long way to go.
True. But you see guys that are as big and athletic as him, they tend to figure it out. He's got a high motor. He's got a good head on his shoulders. I think he wants to be a good defender, or at least I think he will grow into that mindset if he doesn't have it now.
Yeah, but you got to look at, too, they have Brandon Ingram, who's not a terrific defender. And then if you're bringing in Bradley Beal, it's like you're almost giving up on that side of the ball.
True.
It would be my only argument against that thought.
And that's something I worried about too when I was thinking about it. But I just think the way the NBA is going, I think teams, put such a high price on scoring, and I don't think Bradley Beal is as bad of a defender as he was this year. I think he kind of took some time off on the defensive end. Like you said, he's the only offensive threat they have. He's the only real,
creator.
Exactly. He's kind of the focal point of everything. And I think, too, it will light a fire under him that he didn't make the All-Star team, because I think they kind of send a message to him saying, hey, you can't completely ignore defense and expect to be an All-Star.
Well, going to the West wouldn't do him any favors for that either, though.
True. Oh, I know. I'd like to see that pairing of Ingram, Zion, and Bradley Beal. I think they'd be extremely lethal on offense. And
they would. That would be a Mike D'Antoni team. That would be a Mike D'Antoni team.
Right. There you go. That'd be a perfect match right there for him. And I think, too, a lot of the reason I like Derek Favors so much is him and Zion don't look like they'd be a great fit offensively or defensively, really. They kind of seem like they would be redundant, but they were actually the Pelicans' best lineup was when they were in together. In the small amount of time they were in, they were actually like 11 points per 100 possessions better defensively.
Well, that may have to do with, the fact, like, okay, do we pick Hayes, who's a rookie, Melly, who's a rookie, or, Derek Favors, you know what I mean? It may have to do with the roster that they had around him.
Right, but I mean, it showed some promise because they were better with that there, and I think ultimately that's what kind of swung things in his favor for me. Why they decided to keep him. Another thing that I would like to see in free agency, I thought about using that the minimum exception they have to get, it's like $3.6 million or so to try to sign Bryn Forbes from San Antonio. Who knows how free agency will play out? He might get a contract worth a lot more than that. He might not, but I think it never hurts to have more shooters. I think has a good track record all the way back to Michigan State of being a terrific 3-point shooter. And then something that I kind of just want to see almost more just for my own personal feelings is I'd like to see him take a flyer on DeMarcus Cousins, give him another minimum contract. At the very least, he can go back to New Orleans where he was popular when he was there that short time with Anthony Davis. The
A
fans
half a
liked it.
season, yeah.
Right. And they played well together, and he can stretch the floor and shoot. He's obviously, if you ask me, a shell of his former self with all these
Sure.
injuries he's had. He's not going to be a dominant center anymore, but he could space the floor for a guy like Zion or a guy like Ingram to be able to attack the basket a little bit more. And he's somebody that could give you, a pickup off the bench. He's got a good personality. I think he'd be, believe it or not, I think he is a really good teammate. And I think he would be a good presence in their locker room as well.
You would have to sell me really hard on the locker room thing. I think that maybe this is a case where, a star player gets humbled based off of the circumstances that he's been dealt. I mean, playing in LA, with LeBron James and company, right? You have to be a good locker room guy, or else you
right.
know what I mean.
Too, when he was his time in Golden State, they had nothing but good things to say about him there too. And Golden State's one of the premier, franchises as far as building a culture and having a good locker room. And I think,
is it though?
I mean, that's what they say.
I mean, the whole Kevin Durant thing, and
yeah, but I mean, they got Kevin Durant in the first place.
Yeah, that was before he was a part of the locker room.
True. I just think that they've done a great job at building their roster. I think they've got a good coach in Steve Kerr. I just think you hear a lot about around the league about they're very professional and they do things the right way, whatever that means. I don't take too much stock into that because the Detroit Pistons won the NBA championship with Rasheed Wallace and Ben Wallace, and obviously Rasheed Wallace is a little bit of a headache. So I think that talent kind of trumps all in that scenario, but you just hear a lot of good things about Golden State outside of maybe Draymond Green. But I also think too that if DeMarcus Cousins was that much of a problem, I don't think him and Green would have coincided the way they did either.
So. Yeah, well, I mean, we don't know what that would have looked like though, right? Because we saw the injury to Cousins, so
right, he didn't play much.
Right, so I mean, it's easy to be a good locker room guy when you're not really out there, messing plays up or not, standing in the right spot true. And things like that.
Injuries can humble a guy though too. You said
I agree.
Superstar being humbled, and I think he's. I mean, any normal human being would realize that hey, I'm probably not the go-to guy that I was earlier in my career anymore, and it's time to make a change.
Sure, yeah, and I could agree with that. I don't see him, one, going back to New Orleans, and then two, I don't see him going to a team to be the veteran leader. I see, if DeMarcus Cousins comes back to a team, it's a team that thinks it's a piece away from possibly being an NBA champion, like a Miami Heat or even a Los Angeles Lakers reunion, or maybe even the Clippers, or it could be, I think, almost anywhere else. I think he's more of a contender chaser than anything else at this career, based off of just what we've seen recently, right?
Right. I think maybe I'm putting too much stock into it, but I think Zion kind of affects how people in the NBA see New Orleans a lot more than maybe you think, because yeah. I think Bradley Beal would be excited to go play with a guy like Zion. And I want to say this outright. I'm extremely high on Zion Williamson. I'm kind of projecting this out to him being like almost
GOAT
Giannis,
status,
LeBron James level in a few years, where he's the guy in the NBA.
He's got to stay healthy, man. Like, that's the thing is
I agree. That's a big if, but that's true about anybody. And I think as he becomes a pro and learns how to take care of his body better, I mean, he still had baby fat on him. He's 280-pound big kid when he came into the NBA, really, with a high motor and crazy athleticism and more hype than anybody in the last almost 2 decades.
Right.
But ultimately, if he does live up to what I think he could be, I think the Pelicans could become, championship contenders sooner than later.
I think that it's got to take a little bit of time. I mean, we didn't even see LeBron James get a ring in his first place. Right. You know what I mean? So, like, he played in Cleveland. I think that
New Orleans years.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I don't think I could see a very similar thing playing out for Zion, right? Like, I don't think that in New Orleans, right? Like they don't have a track record of being a free agent destination. They don't have a track record of NBA. You know, people care about the prestige of an organization, and yes, Zion Williamson is a tremendous talent. Maybe he gets like an older guy, like LeBron got a Shaquille O'Neal to come to Cleveland for a year, right, to try to win a ring. I just don't see a player in his prime looking to, you know, get a ring, looking at an injury prone Zion Williamson and a poor defensive New Orleans. Like that would be my only argument. I think eventually Zion will have that impact, but I mean, we haven't even seen a free agency built around the potential of having Zion as your premier player. Would be the only thing that I have against that.
Right, and I am probably giving the Pelicans front office a little more credit than maybe they've earned, because I'm kind of, you know, trying to focus on the positive here and saying, hey,
Sure.
if they make these moves, they have a chance to be great, but they could mess it up too. Look what they did with Anthony Davis. Anthony Davis was supposed to be the guy, and they never won anything with him. They hardly even really contended with him, and they struggled to put the right pieces around him.
Exactly.
I just think they have a little bit of a leg up already with Ingram. I think they already have their second star. And I'm not very high on Lonzo Ball. I honestly have lost a lot of, you know, not respect, but I don't think he's nearly
in his game.
Faith. Thank you. That's a good word. I do see the appeal where he could almost just about get you a triple double on any given night.
Sure.
But he's also only going to probably score 10, 12, 14 points. And I think coming into the league, the hype was so high on him, and everybody was so excited to see what he could do with the Lakers. I'm not as high on him as other people are, I don't think. That being said, you know, word around the league is he did get a lot better this season.
He did, if you actually watched.
Shooting did get a lot better. But at the same time, he turned the ball over more than literally everyone in the NBA. 21 turnovers per 100 possessions. He's got to fix that. Otherwise,
I think pace of play and experience of the team around him too, I think, has a lot to do with that. When you have a young team and the only thing that you're doing offensively is run, you know what I mean? You're not running sets. You're without, you know, your star player.
He did look a lot better when Zion came back.
Exactly.
He played his best ball for sure.
He averaged 20 points a game for a little while on that team. I think that you got to give him a little bit more time with this team, and that's why I think going after a star too soon could kind of hurt, right? Because then you're showing your hand a little bit, like, okay, like these guys may not be, you know, the guys that we build around without a third star. You know what I mean?
Right. It would be pretty hard pressed for anybody to give up on the guys that they traded Anthony Davis for that quick too. You know, they're not going to turn around and just dump them for nothing.
Exactly. And, you know, re-signing them, you know, we talked about how cash-strapped they are, you know, using their bird rights and, you know, things like that appropriately. Maybe eventually you could combine some of these draft picks with, you know, a bigger contract with the, you know, Lonzo Ball and other players. Maybe eventually you just add another star player via trade as you start maturing these guys and their game starts to progress and show a little bit more promise.
Yeah, and I could see that for sure too. You know, I may have gone a little too aggressive too quick with going after a superstar like Beal right now. That's kind of how I've always thought about things like this when I think about what I would do as a GM. Is I think talent, obviously you guys have to fit together and you have to gel as a team and have the right system. But I think in the NBA, especially more so than in other professional sports, you see talent usually
translate.
Exactly. You don't see a whole lot of upsets in the NBA playoffs for that very reason, because it takes a superstar to win a title. So
yeah, and I agree with that. But, you know, my take on, you know, free agency in particular, I have a list of guys, just like an NBA team has a list of guys that they want to target in free agency. And I've listed guys like, you know, Bogan Bogdanovic, Joe Harris, Torrey Craig, Davies Bertans, Christian Wood, Justin Holiday, to get another Holiday in, you know, New Orleans, right? And even Jay Crowder in free agency. Now, of these, who I think is probably the most realistic due to their, you know, cash, restrictions and, you know, other things like that in roster space. I think that Torrey Craig is probably the guy you bring in, and then I know that if anybody watching or listening now hears the word Torrey Craig is the guy that you bring in. I know it's not the sexy move, right? But I think it's a smart move because you need a guy who's at least competent on the defensive end. If you go on Synergy and look, his pick and roll defense is above average to excellent. His isolation defense is about average to above average, depending on the type of play it is, right? So bringing in a guy like Torrey Gregg, who's multifaceted, he's a very much a 3-and-D player. He doesn't create much on offense. He stands in the corner and shoot. You don't really need to bring in another creator, especially if you're drafting a guy like Halliburton, Okoro, or Hampton, or Green, right? You don't need another creator, especially when you got guys like Holiday would still be on this team for me, and Lonzo Ball, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who we'll see how he progresses too. I'm very interested to see how he's used as he progresses. So I think bringing in a guy like Torrey Craig is a sign that you're developing, obviously, but you're also wanting to develop the right way, and you're focusing in on a guy who can, play really good defense, which is an issue for this team, especially in the Western Conference. If you don't have one wing defender, you're going to suffer. And you can see the impact that he's had on a team like Denver. And I think even though he's a restricted free agent, I don't think that they want to get in a bidding war over a guy like Torrey Craig when they have guys like Barton, Harris, and then eventually they're going to have to pay Porter Jr. They got Grant on this team too. I think that if New Orleans goes in with a little higher deal than what Denver is comfortable with, they can take a guy like Torrey Craig and improve and keep the dynamic offense that they have and improve defensively.
Yeah, and what you said about it may not be a sexy move. Those small little moves are a lot of times what make all the difference, for a lot of teams. And it is more often than not the right way to build a franchise is to go the long route and to, build it up little by little, make good moves here and there on the fringes. I just like super teams. I want to see another
Who
super
doesn't,
team.
right? Yeah.
I love the idea of all these guys teaming up together, and I'm not a huge on like what KD did going to a team that he lost to. I'm not going to sit here and say it was a weak move or call him a snake or anything. I think, whoever you want to go play with, go play with.
He didn't do anything wrong. I mean,
exactly. It's not like he broke any rules,
Yeah.
I mean, they're too good, so get better and beat them,
Yep.
And I think it was a good thing for the league. The last 2 years where they pretty much it was 4-1 and 4-0 against Cleveland.
Right, yeah.
They weren't the best finals, but they were,
I think what a lot of people take issue with is the fact that, LeBron James obviously is now 35 in his 17th season.
Mm-hmm.
If that super team doesn't exist, then LeBron James probably has another ring or two to his name. Right. And kind of help cement his legacy. So I think that's where a lot of the hate comes from. I mean, yes, you can look at the fact that he joined the team that beat him and they were 73, win team, and, Harrison Barnes helped win them a ring. So obviously Durant's going to make them that much better.
Right.
I mean, that's what you play the game to do, right, is to win a ring. And he went to Brooklyn now with Kyrie Irving. So he's no one's making that as big of a deal, right? Because no one expects Brooklyn to be a team that can slow down, the Los Angeles Lakers. That's where I think a lot of the hate kind of came from with Kevin Durant's move.
Yeah, that's true. Another thing that I kind of wanted to touch on with the Nets and the Kevin Durant situation there. I like Kevin Durant. I am not a fan of Kyrie Irving.
I am with you. I'm a KD guy. I'm not a big Kyrie Irving supporter at all.
And one thing that always has kind of made me laugh a little bit is it's more so fans than really people around the NBA. But you hear fans all the time talk about how they wish players would take less money and to build a winner. Right. And then as soon as they do it, it's the easy way out, and they're the villains. They're the bad guys immediately. Oh, look at this soft guy. He took the easy route to a championship. There's no easy routes to a championship in the NBA.
I mean, to be fair, there's not a direct easy way. Because, even the first year in Miami, that super team, right? They didn't win a ring.
Exactly.
And, Golden State adding Kevin Durant, that if there was an easy way, that was probably it.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that was definitely the closest thing to, well, I don't know, you want to call it a cheat code to get a couple of titles, and that's I think why people say they're those titles have less meaning than maybe some others, but
Dirk Nowitzki's and yeah.
right, but I mean, I guess that's kind of subjective. You know what I mean? I think every NBA title is an NBA title. You're the champion. And,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter if you played in a bubble or if you played 60 games. I mean, to a certain extent, if you played less than 50 games in a shortened season, maybe you put an asterisk. But any semblance of a normal season, regardless of how the league looks, it's still not easy to win an NBA championship.
Right. And it takes a lot of luck and stuff like that too, right? So for my new roster, if we're fixing the Pelicans, my lineup looks a little bit like this. You have Drew Holiday as your one, maybe Halliburton or Hampton or Green, depending on who you draft there. Potentially Okoro. I think if they do draft Okoro, you probably have Redick in your starting lineup still with Okoro off the bench. But rounding it out, you have Torrey Craig, Brandon Ingram, and Zion Williamson as your starting five. I think you need to go ahead and commit to Zion as your five. I don't think that you need to try to pretend like, okay, we're just going to try to work him in there and see what happens. Just go ahead and invest at having, Brandon Ingram and Zion as your 4 and your 5. You got Torrey Craig in there to be your stopper. Maybe Okoro. That's why I'm really big on them trying to get Okoro, because I think that he does help their defense, along with Holiday, who's another great defender as well. And then on the bench, you have Zion, or I'm sorry, not Zion, Lonzo, probably JJ Redick, Jackson Hayes, Justin Holiday, I feel like is another guy that they can get on the cheap. Josh Hart, Nicola Melli, Etuan Moore, Nikhil Alexander-Walker, Kenrich Williams, and then Frank Jackson rounding out your team. And I think that's a pretty talented team. You're probably looking at like an 8 seed, maybe a playoff or a play-in team.
Right. That's definitely, a team that could grow together, that's on the same, time period, time path as far as growth and development. They've got, enough veteran presence to, help those guys with growing pains. But at the same time, they are kind of taking, that youth approach. Let's develop these guys. And I do think that's taken a lot of, having a lot of, really expecting a lot out of your development program. You have to be good at developing players. And I don't know, is David Griffin shown that he's good at developing players? Has he ever really had to? Or because it seems like every year he was with LeBron as his GM, they were just trading picks to get another veteran.
Yeah, depleting their assets to exactly. stack up a roster real quick.
So will he have the patience to kind of go about it the opposite way this time? And I don't know. It remains to be seen. I do like the lineup that you have there. I think it's a solid team, like you said, that could contend for a playoff spot. Mine's a little bit different. I've got starting 5 would be Lonzo Ball, Bradley Beal, Brandon Ingram. I have Zion at the 4, and then Jackson Hayes as their starting 5.
Okay.
I just think Favors fits in better with the second unit, and I think he gives them a little more punch off the bench, along with JJ Redick coming off the bench and Nikhil Alexander-Walker as their backup point guard. They still got Josh Hart. He's a great 3-and-D, wing player. He's a little undersized, I think, for a wing personally, but he does play good defense. Niccolo Melli, I'd like to see a little more out of him. He is what you would call a prototypical stretch 4, but they didn't really play that well offensively with him and Zion out there.
They
together.
did not, no.
Which you would think they would fit well together. But you might be onto something with Zion being their 5. I kind of think positionless basketball is on its way. You've already seen that trend kind of start.
Hello, Houston.
Right. And, my dad said it probably 15 years ago to me when I was a kid, and I thought he was crazy. He said, you'll see in the NBA, by the time you're an adult, it's going to be a league of guys between 6'6" and 6'9" that can all do everything. And really, that's kind of what it's become. I mean, there's still 7-footers, but the game's changed.
They're handling
so
the ball and passing the ball.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not, I don't want to say that they're more skilled. They're just differently skilled. Because post play still takes a lot of skill. The footwork to be a legitimate post threat is high level stuff you have to learn. And I think a lot of NBA players would benefit from a little more post, offensive ability, especially guys like LeBron as they age. I mean, I've always wanted to see LeBron go down in the post and dominate. But regardless, before I get too far off topic, I could see what you're saying about Zion being their center. I mean, it is he Charles Barkley though? Not that Charles Barkley wasn't good, but is he what 6'6", maybe 6'7"?
Maybe in shoes he might be 6'6", 6'7".
He's not a giant guy by any means. That being said, in the few games he did play, he stood out, didn't he? I mean,
yeah, I mean offensively, I think where he would have to commit himself defensively, and I think even though he's undersized, he does give you a chance at the 5 because he's just athletically gifted, superior to very many other 5s. And how many 5s are going to be able to play with him on the court if he's right? You know what I mean? Like, right. How many 5s traditional 5s are going to be able to hang with Zion on the perimeter, putting the ball on the ground, able to pass, able to jump over anybody, or just do a little spin or a Euro step or a just even a little sweep and scoop.
And he's got a pretty shot. He doesn't make it all that much yet, but he's not going to be a terrible shooter for his career. You know what I mean?
I mean, if you saw that San Antonio game, that San Antonio game where he, in that fourth quarter, just went off. Like, people have to respect his ability to at least throw it up there. Here's looking at you, Ben Simmons, right?
Right. That's kind of what I was getting at. He doesn't have a broken jump shot. He doesn't look like somebody that you can't work with as far as that's concerned. And it's interesting to watch, for me at least, to see when he was out there. He kind of had the same feel like he had at Duke. Like you said, he's just, even though he's 19 years old playing against big, giant athletes, he looks like a man amongst boys out there sometimes. Even with guys that are significantly bigger than him, they just kind of bounce off of him. And it's unlike anything I've really seen in a long time. And the weird thing about his defense is he was actually a pretty good defender at Duke. And like his defense slipped way more than you usually see based off of what he was in college. And that's what I was getting at. I think a lot of that has to do with his injuries and that he wasn't completely healthy. So I'm not as worried about his defense. Obviously, he's not going to be, an all-world, all-defense type of guy. But if he works on it and makes that his focal point, is he good enough to get that good? Is he athletic enough to get that good? I think so completely. I think he's one of those generational talents that could set his mind to something and really, really hone that skill.
I mean, I certainly hope so. I'm not as sold on it yet because the minutes limitations that we saw on him in the bubble were kind of concerning because that was unexpected to a lot of people that cover the NBA. Like, no one was expecting them in a scenario, right, where you're up against the clock as soon as you draft a guy like Zion Williamson, and then you're in a place like New Orleans. You're up against the clock. You have to make strides and improvements to show him, even from day one, that this is a place where you want to be. And his very first taste of even coming close to being in the playoffs, where the NBA catered a situation basically for him to be able to be highlighted in a first-round matchup, it was insane to me to see that the Pelicans were like, nah, we're going to save him. Like, what are you saving him for? This is a scenario where you unleash a Zion Williamson. Right. Because imagine them being in a spot where they were battling, even if they lost the play-in game against Portland, like you would think that Zion would be like, okay, like my organization has my back. They want me to be in the best scenario. But instead you saw a very injury-riddled Memphis Grizzlies team hobble their way through a tight game against the Trailblazers, who have played long minutes. You have to think that when that's your first experience as a star player in a small market organization, that's why small organization teams like this fail, because they're trying to do certain things to preserve their guy, which I understand. But like, you can't think in the long term this is for his best interest when we only have him for guaranteed 2 contracts maybe before he demands a trade.
Right. Those are great points, and I agree with all of that, and especially what you said about being up against that window as soon as you draft him. You're on the clock. That's part of the reason I think they go all in sooner rather than later with some of their roster moves, Maybe that was my thinking at least.
Sure.
But one thing about the minutes restriction on Zion, one thing I want to say, and then I have a question for you.
Sure. Go
If
ahead.
you're gonna restrict the guy's minutes, why are you playing him in the first half and not in the fourth quarter? If you
That's a
know you're only
great
going to
point.
play him 25 minutes, why don't you have minutes left for him when the game matters the most? Like that to me, you can't convince me that it makes a difference whether he's playing at the beginning of the game or the end of the game for his health. I just they're professional athletes. They're as prepared for the game as they're going to be. And then my question is, with the trend we've seen of these injuries to top picks, it happened to Ben Simmons, it happened to Embiid, it happened to Blake Griffin. Do you think the Pelicans would have been better off to just let Zion sit this whole year if, in fact, he was as injured as it seems that he was, to the fact that he still needed a minutes restriction all the way at the end of the season?
I would say yes, and here's why. Exhibit A would be Joel Embiid. Exhibit B would be an even more recent exhibit in Michael Porter Jr.
Right.
Both of these guys, had injury histories. Both of these guys, they were kind of managed or whatever. And when you sit these guys, you're not expecting, playoff success. You're not expecting that 8 seed against LeBron James in your first year. You're not expecting any of those things. Right. But what happens when you play this guy is, one, your fan base gets frustrated because, like you said, why is he opening the fourth quarter instead of closing the fourth quarter? You know what I mean? It's things like that. And then you're in a situation, even no one could have predicted this bubble at the beginning of the year, but you could easily see that a play-in scenario was probably likely, right, either this season or next, with how innovative, Adam Silver is, right? So
Right.
At some point, you have to imagine that we're probably going to be in a scenario where we're going to be playing meaningful games. And now there's an expectation, because you have Zion Williamson listed on your roster and that he is playing, you're getting your fan base excited, or not even just your fan base, but just guys like you and I, Austin, guys who are just NBA heads and love the game. You're getting us all hyped up and ready to see Zion Williamson play. And you're not divulging that, yeah, he's going to be on a 20-minute. We're only going to play him 15, 20 minutes a game. You're not sharing that. So now we're taken aback by that. Like, why? Like, what's going on? Now your organization is having questions asked about what's going on. Like, we're having the conversation right now. Is it worth playing him or not? Because of the way that they're doing it. They didn't have those questions in Philadelphia when they were tanking for 1 million draft picks. We didn't have these questions for, Michael Porter Jr., and maybe a large part of that is because Denver was a good team without him. They didn't need to rush him along, and you just got rid of your star player in New Orleans. You need to give your season ticket holder something to be excited about. Maybe Brandon Ingram exploding this year would have been enough for that if you would have said, we're not having Zion play, and your fans are like, oh man, this sucks. But then you have Brandon Ingram explode, and you're like, could you imagine next year when we have Zion Williamson fully healthy and then a Brandon Ingram with a Lonzo Ball and a draft pick?
Think about how much better just the mindset around the team and the fans would be if they just barely missed the playoffs without Zion, and now you're adding in the number 1 pick who's supposed to be this all-world talent.
Yep.
Obviously it's a lot brighter way to look at things. But
you're not setting up an Alvin Gentry, to be hamstrung, and probably isn't going to get another head coach job in the NBA. Let's be honest.
I hate to say it, unfortunately, because I like the guy. I think he was a good coach, but I think he was a lame duck coach going into the year, no matter what happened, unless they won like an NBA title. Yeah. I don't think that the front office was sold on him being the guy.
He was a fall guy, like you said earlier. He's just the guy to carry all the blame, and I hated that because he wasn't the guy for the job before the season started, but the way that they hamstrung him in the bubble scenario and firing him after that just to make it look like it was all his fault, like, really rubbed me the wrong way.
And every single young guy on that team got better. That's something that I definitely noticed. All of those guys, especially the ones that came from the Lakers, got significantly better. When obviously they had a little more, reps, they got the ball a little bit more, they had more chances to do things within the offense, but Lonzo Ball got significantly more efficient on offense. He learned how to shoot, basically, it seemed like overnight.
Yeah, well, their shooting coach is the guy that's getting a lot of credit for that, right? Not their head coach, Alvin Gentry, but they did bring in like a world-renowned shooting coach.
Okay.
which is largely credited for the
Right, because
rebirth of his shot. And
Brandon Ingram made a crazy leap in his 3-point shooting too. So maybe it is that guy. I didn't know that, but that's good.
Yep.
One thing that I kind of do wonder about this Zion situation, though, a couple of things is knowing that you're not going to have him for the full season and you're not probably going to compete for more than maybe the 8th seed. One, is it worth it putting him out there for 15, 20 games, knowing that it may not even be enough to bolster your playoff chances? And two, do you think that the Pelicans felt pressure from the media and the league to get Zion out there? Because I think that's legitimately could have been part of it too, because he was such a media darling. He had so much hype. Everybody was talking about him more than just about anybody from the minute he was drafted. And we saw what the NBA did in the bubble, trying to put him, front and center in front of everybody.
Showcase him. Yeah.
Do you think that maybe their front office, kind of got this feeling like, oh, the league's office is looking over our shoulder. They want this guy on TV. We need to try to get him out there.
I mean, you can feel pressure, but I mean, ultimately it's your decision at the end of the day. I mean, I feel like Philadelphia felt pressure at one point, right? And when they were getting like all these first round draft picks and, trading players away, and then you eventually ended up with a Joel Embiid and a, Ben Simmons and what could have been a Jason Tatum, but ended up being a Markelle Fultz. Everyone was excited about that. And, the NBA ended up shifting their odds around because of how Philadelphia did that, right? So, and Cleveland at one point too, right? So,
right,
you can feel pressure, but it doesn't mean you have to bend to the will of the NBA, because ultimately it's your job on the line, right? And I think that we saw it bear out where the New Orleans Pelicans did get new front office people. They are now going to be getting a new head coach, so you had to kind of make some people look like the bad guy, at one point. But now, if the NBA is pressuring them, I mean, I would tell Adam Silver, hey, do you want this guy who's supposed to be the next face of the NBA? Do you want him to be right, or do you want him to be out there, just getting you money? And then we ruin this guy by playing him when he's not ready and he's damaged goods for the rest of the career. And then he ends up like a Tracy McGrady. Like, I would hate that for Zion Williamson, where he's like, could you imagine how good Zion Williamson would have been if he would have been healthy his whole career? Yeah, or Grant Hill would probably be an even better comparison.
Well, when you were naming all those guys that sat their first year because of injuries and all the positive cases of that, all I could think about was Greg Oden and how the hype around him was he was the next Shaquille O'Neal. He was the next generational center.
Taken before Kevin Durant,
right? And nobody really thought that was a reach back then either.
Yeah, and everyone knew how good KD was going to be. Like, everybody knew that.
Exactly. He didn't grow 7 inches overnight. He was a 6'9" or 10 scoring threat from the day he stepped onto the scene at Texas. Everybody knew how good Durant was going to be, and it was still pretty much consensus to take Oden number 1. I don't know if you remember when he started his freshman year at Ohio State, he had a broken wrist and shot like 79% from the free throw line left-handed.
Yeah, and he had Mike Conley helping him out too. So
right. Oh yeah, he definitely had talent around him. But they're from Indiana. Their high school's not far from where I live, and so I kind of followed both of their careers a lot. And it always drove me nuts to hear people say that Mike Conley was the reason those teams won, because it was people. I don't know why people thought that, but it was Greg Oden.
No, Conley was a bit of a project coming. He wasn't right in the NBA until about year 3 or 4.
Exactly. And he was good in college and he was good in high school. He was terrific in high school. But Greg Oden was on another level. And it would just be a nightmare scenario for something like that to happen with Zion. And especially with, leg, knee, feet, that always worries me, especially with bigger guys. Those are hard injuries to come back from.
And then we're going to be talking like, how did the Pelicans draft Zion Williamson over a Ja Morant? Because if Ja Morant stays healthy,
he's looking like he's going to be a superstar too.
Exactly.
And, I just think when I say pressure, maybe not so much pressure from the league, but there is pressure to put Zion on the floor because
No, I agree. I think even from the league,
seats, you've got to keep your fans happy. There's a lot that goes into that decision making, and it's a lot easier said than done to stand up and say, "Hey, this is the way we're going to do it, no matter what." When even like you said with Philadelphia stayed the course until they didn't. And as soon as they got rid of their GM, they traded away almost all the guys that they spent all that time building up those draft assets to get. And I mean, I don't think it's worked. I think they were a more well put together team before, and they had better shooting.
Yeah, but, with Covington and Saric.
It's hard to forge your own path. It's hard to create a new way of thinking to do things and to stick to it when it gets difficult. And I think we've seen it time and again that teams tend to go back to what they know.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that you did bring up a good point. I think that the league office probably does put a lot of pressure on a guy who, like you mentioned, like people were watching him play at 14, 15 years old. Like we've heard his name 3-4 seasons before he was even in college, let alone
he's already
drafted.
On the cover of 2K. I mean,
exactly, and he played 19 games. Like he's got so much star power that there was a quote unquote debate on who wins Rookie of the Year for some reason, just because it's the name Zion Williamson. Like even though he only played 19 games, and John Morant had a far more healthy season and just as star-studded of performances. Like he has so much cachet, and you can look at like the college basketball ratings before he was at Duke, while he was at Duke, and after he left. And just the NCAA lost so many just casual viewers because Zion Williamson was out there. And you better believe that the NBA saw those and were thinking, and you saw how many primetime games the Pelicans had this season with a rookie that didn't even play. And then they had the primetime opening game matchup when the season restarted too.
Mm-hmm. Oh, he's like a force of nature already at 19 or 20 years old with almost no games under his belt. If he never played another game, he would be like a shooting star of incredible magnitude just for the amount of hype that he's had. Like LeBron didn't even have hype quite like this. You know what I mean?
I don't know. I mean, we may need to pump. We need to pump the brakes a little bit on that. LeBron was definitely on ESPN in high school, like with maybe not to the magnitude because social media wasn't a thing when LeBron was there. But I mean, LeBron definitely was a big deal,
right,
in high school.
That's a good point. And he was. Oh, don't get me wrong. I know he was. He was. The exact same kind of scenario, and he obviously lived up to it. And if Zion lives up to it too, it's nothing but good things for the NBA.
Nothing but good things, and they have a lot of young players to be excited about.
All across the league, and the Pelicans especially. They've got Ingram and Williamson are both future perennial all-stars, if you ask me.
Two of the best under 25-year-olds in the NBA, and you hope that they do better with their guys than what we've seen in places like Philadelphia or even Minnesota with Wiggins and Towns.
Right. I always thought those two were going to be incredible too, and they haven't been able to do anything in the league. And I can't wrap my head around why Karl Anthony Towns isn't better.
I mean, he's 8 3-pointers a game as a center is pretty phenomenal, but his defense there's a lot we could dig into there, and we probably save that for another. How do we fix an X team? Right, we got to come up with a better slogan. Like fixing the NBA or something like that. Right, but
we'll figure it out.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. We got good ideas, so we'll get it in there. But Austin, man, it was a phenomenal conversation, man. I appreciated all the creativity that you brought in, even just preparing for this, and very much looking forward to covering the NBA playoffs with you, and writing more articles and stuff like that for All Aspect Sports. And just before we go, man, I want you to say something nice to the folks and go ahead and promote the show and promote the site.
Awesome. Well, first off, thanks for all the kind words. I'm extremely excited to be a part of All Aspect Sports and to be your co-host. I think you're one of the better basketball minds that I've ever had these many good conversations with.
Oh,
It's hard to find people, honestly, when you're as into it as I think you and I are. It's hard to find people that really understand like the level to which you
right.
you know,
That don't look
focus in
at
on
you
the
like you're a psychopath for caring this
right.
much about sports.
It takes a kindred kind of spirit to look at that big board that you made and think it's awesome and not crazy.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
But that being said, there's a lot of awesome stuff going on our site. I'm working on a composite article from just about everybody, or at least the majority of everybody on our team, given our NBA Finals picks. And not to spoil it, but they are pretty consensus on who everybody thinks is going to win.
Huh.
I won't divulge that until you guys go over to the site and read it once I post it up there. But I am not of the same opinion as just about everyone else. I usually take the dissenting opinion on purpose. This time it just happened that way.
The path not taken.
Well, that and I kind of like playing devil's advocate. I think it's fun. I enjoy, like when they talked about Kobe Bryant going into opposing arenas and just thriving off of the booze and stuff. Mm-hmm. I don't mind being the bad guy or being the guy that everybody looks at like, why would you think
Kobe
that?
Bryant. You're Kobe Bryant. You're
exactly.
Okay.
Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, whatever you want to call it. No, but like I said, I just appreciate the opportunity. I'm super excited to see how everything evolves and where we go from here. I think everybody on the team has great ideas. I think, you and I have a lot of good ideas. I think we've got a lot of exciting stuff in store for everybody. So thank you for listening. Please keep listening, keep reading our articles. It's only going to go up from here.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree. And Austin, I keep singing praises all the work that you do. The breakdown that you had of, how the teams performed in the bubble, I thought was top notch, and how you divided them into 5 separate tiers, and the way that you kind of grouped like teams together and went through and explained all of those things. I thought that was a great piece. And, for anyone watching or listening now or later, go to All Aspect Sports and go find Austin's work. It's stellar stuff. We also have, NFL, NBA, NCAA, and some MMA, which our guy Patrick Graham had, a little bit of a scare there towards the end with the main card there, but he eventually did call it right. I think all of us were shocked to see, Sugar Sean O'Malley get rocked by Vera there. But, we got some good stuff going on over there, and just appreciate all the love and support that we're getting from you guys watching and listening now or later. And, as for us, we're the Breaking the Game podcast. You can follow us anywhere podcasts are available. You can follow us on social media. At Twitter, you can follow us at BTG NBA Pod, and you can follow us the same thing over at Instagram. Are you ready, Austin? Go ahead.
Yes.
At BTG NBA Pod. There we go. We're cool because we can point at our social media handles.
Right.
Go ahead and follow us anywhere podcasts are available. Get us on social media. If you got anything that you want to discuss or have us, go over for the show, email us at breakingthegamepodcast@gmail.com, and we'll go over everything that you guys want to talk about. We would love to hear from you guys. Big shout out to all of our listeners here in the States and in Europe. We got people in Belgium, Italy, Ireland, Greece, so we got some Canada, some Canada love, some Mexico love, just everywhere, cool. Philippines, Australia. I mean, we're international, Austin. I don't know if you know that.
The NBA is the world's game, man. I'm telling you.
That's 100% right. But as for us here at the Breaking the Game podcast, I have to go to work here soon, so we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. You guys, the viewers and the listeners, you guys have been awesome. As always, I've been your coach, Stephen Gillespie. My lovely assistant, Austin Carr, has been awesome as well. Lovely, very much so. And we'll catch up with you guys next time. Much love, everybody.
Yep. Have a good night, everybody. Thanks for listening.